Hello, the doc is in, and welcome back to another chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen, chapter 228. We're getting a continuation of the Gojo versus Sukuna fight. As expected, last chapter, we ended off with the tiny domain, domain, curse technique reversal, reverse curse technique. So I guess you could say domain reverse. So instead of domain expansion, domain minification, something like that. Anyway, point is we got a tiny domain. So we're gonna get into that in a second. But I'm also doing content on the anime, which just dropped the first episode yesterday for the Hidden Inventory arc. Just to give my personal thoughts on that really quickly. W animation. W series. I'll be watching every episode. I'm covering the most recent chapter of JJK. I usually have a rule that once I know the story of a show, I usually am not that interested in the anime anymore, just because I already know what's gonna happen, so it kind of doesn't matter. But JJK is a little special. All right, it is breaking barriers. There's some kind of irony in there. It's breaking barriers for me and making me watch every episode in full. Sat myself down, I watched the whole episode. I was hyped. I was hyped. I already know what's gonna happen, but I was like, oh snap, go crazy. What's big Gojo gonna do? Anyway, so yeah, that was all that. Don't forget to watch the shorts. Check out the shorts. I put in a little work in them. But yeah, that all being said, let's get into this chapter. So, chapter starts off. We go back to our showcasters, our boys and gals, and they're basically talking about the small domain. And basically, Kusakabe once again, he's like making a domain smaller than even a basketball, which is actually kind of putting in perspective how small this is. Because I still thought it was reasonably sized, maybe the size of maybe I don't know, a locker, a cabinet or something. They're saying it's smaller than a basketball. That's tiny, which in and of itself, as Kusakabe points out, is kind of insane. But Maki points out, she's like, oh well, it's smaller, but that's not that crazy. But basically, Kusakabe kind of breaks down. He's like, hey, making domains that small isn't really normal or usually feasible, and having one that's smaller than even your own bodies is usually basically impossible and would basically make your barrier fall apart immediately. But then Chozo makes a good point, and he's like, well, prism realm, maybe Gojo was able to analyze a prism realm, how that works, because it's just a tiny cube that can fit in your hand, yet it's the space that at least fits one whole person / just a bunch of dead bodies and skulls and stuff, which means that theoretically it's an infinite space. Maybe not literally, but theoretically it's an infinite space that at least can fit a whole human body, yet still be held in someone's hand on the outside. And so likely that's how he figured it out. He used concepts from the prism realm, how he was in there, and then basically adapted it into his domain. And Kusakabe kind of points out, he's like, oh, it's weird that it's still, well, not weird, but it's still kind of crazy that Sukuna and Gojo can on the fly just change the entire makeup and structure of their barrier just on the fly. And he basically explains that creating a barrier and creating a domain expansion, all that stuff is pretty particular. You gotta I guess mentally put it all together, and that kind of is it. So the idea that you kind of just make it and then take all that work in progress that would have taken to even create the one barrier and just redo it on the fly is kind of crazy. Hikari and Higuruma are kind of surprised about this, because for them, their curse technique is almost directly reliant on their domain expansion, and so creating one in the first place was well, for Hikari, we would say that we can assume that it was fairly easy, but for Higuruma, we know for a fact that it was very, very, very early on into his curse technique, curse energy journey, him creating a domain expansion. But Kusakabe basically explains that for you guys, your domain expansion is inherent into your curse technique. They're a one-to-one thing. You can't have your curse technique without also having the domain expansion. So that's why for you guys, it may not have been a whole experimental thought process, rather than for most people where you gotta consciously create the domain, like kind of for Gojo. They then go back to looking at the screens and they see that, oh, the domain is like shaking very violently. As Kusakabe then theorizes like, oh, well, was creating this tiny domain not that stable or so? And they're looking at it shake, and it doesn't seem to be breaking. And then all of a sudden, the shaking then turns into a bunch of slashes, I guess coming from the inside, then kind of showing like shockwaves that come out, kind of, that look like Sukuna slashes. And then it occurs to everybody that, oh, what likely happened was that after the domain was created, this then followed with Sukuna probably changing his domain to be small within Gojo's barrier and work inside Gojo's barrier. And also because he made his domain also just as small as Gojo's, that makes it as potent as Gojo's. And if they're equal, then blah blah blah. He breaks the barrier, right? And so once again, Gojo's been blasted out of his domain. Sukuna's is up, but something's a little different this time. Got Yuji staring at Sukuna. He's like, oh no, Gojo Sensei, what's going on? Everybody's looking, and then the shrine falling apart. Sukuna, I want to say blasted in the chest, but his chest bleeding, mouth bloody, and everybody's like, they start cheering. I'm like, let's go. I was never worried about Gojo in the first place. But anyway, right. So it seems like finally Gojo has won one domain clash, which given third time's a charm, so it makes sense, right? So now it seems like Gojo's on the up foot, and Kusakabe kind of goes into this moment where he's like, oh, how long was the domain open for? And he's asking the students to know. And B was like, wait, but you didn't pay attention to the time. He's like, well, that's a student shop. And then Mei is like, it was 3 minutes and 9 seconds. 3 minutes since, exactly 3 minutes since the domain was actually broken. 9 seconds was before was when Sukuna's domain also went down, right? And so then Higuruma, Maki, Yuta, and Angel then discuss a little bit about the situation as far as, okay, they both use the domain expansion, they're both out of the domain, so is anyone going to use their curse technique? And Higuruma's like, oh, well, they're out of curse technique. Maki's like, well, Gojo can heal his. And then Yuta and Angel are basically like, actually, there's an important detail about that. If Sukuna saw it, he could probably do it. And the logic here is that Sukuna was sealed for many years, right? But we know that Geto, Kenjaku, whatever, took Sukuna's body, sliced it into fingers, and broke his soul up into all those fingers, and then hid them away, right? And then he could be revived through the fingers. Sukuna, after being revived, was able to figure out how to split his soul into the thingies, even though he was never taught how to do it. But all he did was just literally have it done to him / saw it. So, with that logic, considering that he has the cursed energy necessary to actually conduct the technique or skill or whatever, then there isn't really anything holding Sukuna back from just doing the same thing in this instance and reverse curse technique, healing his burnt out curse technique. But after coming to that conclusion, we then go back to the fight, and we got Sukuna running away, getting chased by Gojo. Gojo's doing gravity stomps as well in Sukuna's path, and Sukuna's running away. Another big stomp from Gojo, but eventually space runs out for Sukuna. Boxing time. Gojo, spin kick to the chest, to the chest area. Sukuna blocks. Sukuna throws Gojo away, and Gojo's like, all right, there's something suspicious going on. And Gojo's theorizing like how the community's theorizing. He's like, why isn't he using the 10 shadows technique? Now, we don't really need to break down all the thought process, because if you've been in the community for a little bit and you watch your JJK content week to week as chapters come out, you already know why it makes sense for Sukuna to use the 10 shadows technique and why it's a really big boon that he's able to use it. Because as Sukuna's taken over Megumi's body, so he has all Megumi's memories, Gojo has explained to Megumi that a 10 shadows user was able to defeat a 6 eyes Infinity user using the 10 shadows. So, logically speaking, with Sukuna having access to these abilities, why doesn't he just go ahead and use them to try to beat Gojo? Given the Gojo user, Six Eyes user from the past may not be the same as current Gojo, but same concept applies. If it was powerful enough to beat them, then it should be powerful enough in like a super amped body to do something of use, right? And so as Gojo's theorizing about this, he's like, oh, why isn't he using it? Now, the community has theorized that the reason why Sukuna's not using it is because he doesn't want to admit his defeat by saying basically that, hey, I can't beat you with just my techniques and domain, so I have to use Megumi's techniques and domain as well in conjunction with my stuff to actually beat you. A pseudo defeat, which Sukuna theoretically would have, but it's also been kind of counterpointed by the fact that, like, if Sukuna really wants to win, he'll basically do whatever. He doesn't actually care about honor in that sense. He just doesn't do stuff because he's prideful, and most times just because it's for fun. In this instance, we realized that all of the stuff previously, it was not a prideful thing. It was for fun, apparently, because Sukuna then proceeds to be like, you know what? Click. The Maharaga wheel is in effect. And then immediately, Gojo starts bleeding from his nose. End of chapter. Wild stuff. Alright, so, once again, theory time. I got a theory right here. Alright. So, the Maharaga wheel adapts. Right. It makes the user the Maharaga wheel, the actual, I guess it's not a technique, it's more like a cursed tool, I think, that's connected to Maharaga, basically makes anything adapt to anything, right? What if Sukuna reversed the Maharaga wheel, and so he, kind of like reverse curse technique, he applied it to Gojo, making anything more damaging to the user. Oh, to the not the user, but to the person who it's being used on, right? So my logic here is that basically the Maharaga wheel basically makes anything not do damage. So the opposite would be that it makes everything do damage. So in this case, maybe he made the Maharaga wheel adapt to Gojo's reverse curse technique, therefore making the constant reverse curse technique that Gojo's always using, which has been specified before, that he's always using it on his brain, so that then his brain isn't overloaded by Infinity and Six Eyes. It is now poisoning him, which is why at the end of the chapter he's like Tisk, and he's like, oh, thingy. It also would explain the little ending blurb where it's like, what do those eyes see through? Where the idea could be that the Maharaga wheel has always been on Gojo, or something along those lines, because we actually don't see where the wheel is. It's not like when we saw it with Yorozu, where he did the technique name and then pulled out the wheel, or not even pulled. Yeah, he did a little bit of technique stuff and he pulled out the wheel, or he was able to get the wheel, and we saw the wheel very obviously there, and then he called out Maharaga. In this case, we don't actually know where the wheel is whatsoever. You see a black area where the wheel is, so potentially maybe the wheel has already been applied to Gojo from before, but he just didn't notice for one reason or another, and now it's gone into effect. But other than that, good chapter. I thought it was good. Not too many crazy things. Obviously we got the domain stuff, but we kind of already, a lot of that stuff was just further explanation on things we kind of theorized about over the past week or so. So yeah, good chapter. We're finally going to see the 10 shadows be used against Gojo, this should get interesting. So with that all being said, thank you for watching, and the doc is out. Peace.
Thank you for watching. Feel free to subscribe and watch the videos on the right. Other than that, the doc is out. Bye.